This is the seventh round of negotiations between Iran and signatories of the 2015 nuclear deal, as well as the United States. And one of the main sticking points for the Europeans had been Iran's compliance with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Until now.
Last night, we reached a good agreement with the IAEA that could address some of the alleged concerns about Iran's peaceful nuclear program and lead to continued mutual cooperation with the IAEA. Two series of texts are being discussed in Vienna. The first is the result of 6 rounds of talks. At the same time, other parties have agreed to have Iran's newly proposed texts on the table so as to achieve a single, concise text from discussions and combination of all of these.
Iran says the IAEA will now be able to allow to have cameras at one of its sensitive sites. The Director General of the UN nuclear watchdog has had some serious concerns about the lack of access to what was taking place at a workshop just outside Tehran, where centrifuges are being made. But in June, one of the cameras was attacked and damaged. Iranian officials accused Israel of sabotage. Then, Iranian officials took all 4 IAEA cameras offline and refused to allow inspectors to replace them. Now, with this technical agreement with the IAEA, there is hope that the talks here in Vienna will get the push they need to move forward.
In a practical sense, it means that the IAEA again will be able to monitor the production of centrifuge components. This is what the Karaj facility does. And the reason for doing this is for the IAEA to have a better handle on whether any centrifuge components might be taken away from Karaj to be assembled into centrifuges at some secret site.
The remaining signatories of the nuclear deal have been meeting since April to try and get the US and Iran to return to the agreement, which was aimed at limiting Iran's nuclear program in exchange for economic benefits and sanctions relief. While the US is not directly talking to Iranian officials here in Vienna, there seems to be renewed optimism about the 7th round of talks. And now that the main issue between Iran and the IAEA seems to be resolved, it will be up to the Americans to put forth what they're willing to do to convince Iran to return to full compliance. Dorsa Jabari, Al Jazeera, Vienna.
Latest news out of Iran. Political headliner. Iran nuclear talks go back to the future. Dated December 18, 2021. After 3 weeks of talks, discussions on the Iran nuclear deal are essentially back to where they were at the beginning of the summer. Yet diplomats said even that reflects progress after 5 months in which negotiations were on pause following the election in June of Ibrahim Raisi, a hardline conservative, as president of Iran. Enrique Mora, the senior European Union official coordinating the talk, said, "We now have a text that with some minor exceptions is a common ground for negotiations." Iran resumed negotiations with the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China on November 29th, with the European Union acting as coordinator of the talks. Since then, talks have been perpetually close to collapsing, with Iran's new regime making fresh demands and restricting access to its nuclear facilities. Now, diplomats say they've agreed to work off the text from before the election with slight amendments to reflect the latest Iranian proposals. Modest progress, a senior U.S. State Department official said. We now have a common understanding of what the text will be that will serve as the basis of negotiations on nuclear issues. It is in the interest of all sides to keep the talks alive, even with a weak heartbeat. European countries have long championed the deal. Iran's economy is suffering under heavy sanctions, and the United States wants to show it is making every diplomatic effort. Still, officials said that negotiations needed to pick up if they were to be successful, as the fast pace of Iran's nuclear advances is eroding the potential benefits of the deal. This only can take us back nearer to where the talks stood in June, said European diplomats, cautioned in a joint briefing. The senior State Department official echoed the sentiment. What is now on the table, the official said, is an agenda of issues to be examined, not a set of solutions to be accepted. Iran and the United States are not holding direct negotiations, with Tehran still smarting over former U.S. President Trump's decision to withdraw from the deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018. Instead, they rely on European diplomats to act as the go-betweens. When Iran turned to the table in November, it was unwilling to resume negotiations on the basis of texts that had been negotiated by the previous Iranian administration earlier in the year, changing almost 90% of what had been agreed to be in June. European and U.S. negotiators considered this approach unacceptable and said it had prevented them from getting down to real negotiations. Iran's new negotiation team under Deputy Foreign Minister Ali Baghdadi Khani also brought new demands to the table. According to a senior Western diplomat, Iran wants, among other things, broader access to carbon fiber, as previously reported by the Wall Street Journal. The material is commonly used in airplanes and sporting equipment, but can also be used to produce centrifuges, rotors that are used to enrich uranium. Iran also demanded that all sanctions are to be removed, including that those have been imposed by Trump under the so-called maximum pressure campaign. Western officials said that the U.S. had put a good offer on the table, and that it was up to Iran to accept it. The issue of sanctions lifting has not been the main focus during the 7th round of talks. According to a senior State Department official, we haven't gotten to that point yet. Separately, a collapse of the nuclear talks was averted on Wednesday after the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, reached a Russia-brokered agreement with Iran on allowing international inspectors to replace cameras at a workshop in Karaj, the city west of Tehran, where parts for centrifuges are produced. By reaching the agreement, Iran avoided a censure resolution the U.S. had threatened to present to the IAEA Board of Governors before the end of the year. Iran had said that it would walk away from the nuclear negotiations in such an event. The cameras needed to be replaced because one of the 4 IAEA cameras was destroyed in June in what Iran calls as an act of sabotage that it blamed on Israel. The other 3 cameras were removed by Iran, and they have been kept their memory cards, saying that they will only return them once an agreement that the nuclear talks is reached and sanctions are lifted. IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi on Friday showed a sample camera similar to the ones that will be reinstalled at the Karaj assembly plant to a packed room of international journalists. In an apparent riposte to Iranian claims that the cameras can be hacked, Grossi explained that the cameras cannot be tampered with as they are under IAEA seal and not connected to a computer. Ali Baghdadi Khan, Iran's chief negotiator, framed it differently, saying that the pace of reaching an agreement depends on the will of the other side. They accept Iran's logical views and positions. The new round of talks can be the last round, and we can reach an agreement as soon as possible. The 8th round of talks will begin in Vienna after a break, most likely before the end of the year. Headliner: Iran pledges crushing response against any Israeli attack. Dated December 20th, 2021. Iran will retaliate with a crushing response against any Israeli attack, the commander said, according to an Iranian news agency linked to the country's top security body. Giolami Rashid said during a military maneuver which started on Sunday, if Israel carries out attacks against Iran, our armed forces will immediately attack all centers, bases, routes, and spaces used to carry out the aggression. Last week, the Tehran Times newspaper published an article revealing a map of a dozen Iranian targets in Israel in an event the Islamic Republic opts to strike the Jewish state. In the article entitled "Just One Wrong Move," the paper said the Zionist regime has forgotten that Iran is more than capable of hitting them from anywhere. The piece was published days after it was revealed by Ynet's sister publication, the Yedioth Ahronoth, revealed that Israel's alleged strike on Syrian chemical weapon sites 6 months ago was a direct message to its enemies. Chief of General Staff of Iran's armed forces, Mohammad Bagheri, was quoted by the paper as saying that Iran never takes lightly threats made by its enemies. He was quoted as saying, "Despite our confidence in our deterrence, our forces are prepared for the smallest of threats in the strategic field. At the strategic level, we do not intend to strike anyone, but at the operational and tactical level, we are ready for a decisive response and a quick and tough offense against the enemy." That's the latest news. And now my thoughts. Just last Monday, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz declared that punishing sanctions, which have gutted Iran's economy and that left it without any bargaining power, should not be given any leniency. In fact, Gantz's comments were made to the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and that came after days after the frustration of the talks between Iran and the European Union regarding the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran has been the antagonist in all this. Not so much Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia is right behind them. But it seems that Iran is trying to push it because they don't trust the United States, and that the United States is trying in every option on their part to try and not have a conflict. Israel is the only country that is exasperating or exaggerating the need for a conflict because they don't have to fight. They know it will come at the U.S. coalition's expense, and it will come at the lives of U.S. soldiers, not Israeli ones. And this is not just Israel itself. I mean, we do have a faction of government that is even calling for a conflict. I don't think Biden wants the conflict, to be honest with you. However, there was a statement in which a number of quote unquote diplomats, including two former CIA directors, Leon Panetta and David Petraeus, statements called Statement on Improving the Potential for a Diplomatic Resolution to the Iran Nuclear Challenge. And this is dated on December 17th, 2021. In it, it's a long statement, I'll quote you. Quote, without convincing Iran it will suffer severe consequences if it stays on its current path, there is little reason to hope for the success of diplomacy. And given the speed with which Iran is moving forward with its nuclear program, such consequences cannot be limited to political isolation, condemnatory resolutions, an international forum, and additional economic sanctions, all of which are a necessary part of an American strategy toward Iran, but are not sufficient at this stage to convince Iran's leaders that the price they will pay requires them to alter their course. Therefore, for the sake of the diplomatic effort to resolve the crisis, we believe it is vital to restore Iran's fear that its current nuclear path will trigger the use of force against it by the United States. The challenge is how to restore U.S. credibility in the eyes of Iran's leaders. Words, including formulations that are more pointed and direct than all options are on the table, are also necessary, but not sufficient, end quote. And of course, this is the only language the United States knows how to speak. And that goes for the same with Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and their coalition partners. In the statement, they also said that they believed that it was important for the Biden administration to take steps that could lead Iran to believe that persisting in its current behavior will put to risk its entire nuclear infrastructure. And of course, at the end, you have the declaration that, let us be clear, we're not urging the Biden administration to threaten regime change or to advocate for a regime change under cover of non-proliferation. But that's exactly what they're proposing. That's exactly what Israel proposes. And this is exactly what Qatar proposes and the United Arab Emirates. Now, yeah, there's talks going on, and there's actual quote unquote conferences that are just delaying the inevitable. And I think next year or some part of next year or within near the end of the Biden administration, if it's 2024. But I think we're on the verge of war with Iran. Now, I've been saying this for a while, but reading you the news and reading the latest updates about what's happening at these conferences in Vienna, or lack of coordination between the coalition and Iran thereof, and with the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia holding closed door meetings between the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, and who knows what intelligence agencies are doing behind those closed doors. I don't trust any one of those countries to push a plan for peace. Now, this is not a generalization on the United States either. Now, you do have some parts of the government that don't want this to happen. And I'm willing to suggest that Biden right now, as old as he is not physically and mentally prepared to engage in a conflict. This will be a young man's war. It's going to cause a ton of economic strife, a ton of lives, a ton of economic expenditures to the wrong agencies and corporations. But the War Department is thirsty for a new conflict. Afghanistan now lost, Syria a losing battle, Iraq no longer interesting. Iran can bring back the ghouls of the Department of Defense and the foreign lobbyists and the private military industrialists who will make money hand over fist in procuring and producing weapons on the market. God knows, regarding the illegal drug routes which pay for the black operations, opium production will probably go through the roof again. And now that we're facing the new strains of the pandemic, economic strife and hardships will be exasperated if this war is to commence. And that's why we need more rational voices out there. For those who follow my channel, I'd like to see more of you join me in being vocal and talk about the important issues and to condemn the factions of government who are promoting war to an ignorant public.